1922, Lenin suffers a stroke. Front on this podium are Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, exercising power for Lenin. In the back is Joseph Stalin, the new General Secretary of the party's Central Committee, and at this time still relatively unknown.
Imagine a world in which you are not allowed to express your opinion, in which you don't have your freedom of speech or anything private, for that matter. And if you decide to oppose any of these things, certain people will send you to, let's call it, a vacation. But not a vacation you think of. Hell no. Not an island with nice soft sand and sunny weather, but an island you thought existed only in the worst fairy tales. It's hard to understand what the will of a single person is capable of. And throughout our history, unfortunately for us, those people and their goals were almost always on the wrong side. And Joseph Stalin was definitely one of those people. A man who was responsible for millions of deaths during his lifetime, and the worst part is, even the deaths of his own people. Many remember him as a cruel dictator who is mostly associated with the Second World War. But I assure you, his monstrous acts reach far back in the past, which always prompts a question why Joseph Stalin is not portrayed as equally bad as Adolf Hitler. The Soviet history already had many bloody chapters, and Joseph Stalin was preparing to begin a new one, the one he called Collectivization. The term originated as an idea that consisted of all peasants and farmers in the weaker areas, such as Ukraine, giving up their private lands and starting to work on farms owned by the Union. Stalin's main focus was on ethnic minorities, intellectuals, or kulaks, who were known as independent and often under-contributed. Now, like every sane person out there, this sounded like something straight out of a crazy land, and quite normally a large number of people disagreed with this ordinance. In the attempt to prevent this from happening, peasants destroyed their tools, slaughtered their animals, and burned down their crops, which they preferred rather than handed it over. So Stalin did what he knew best. All those who opposed him either were shot or sent to the Gulag. In the upcoming years, the gulags were unsurprisingly getting overcrowded, and they needed to come up with some sort of a different solution. They needed, let's call it, a new thinking head, and luckily for Stalin, and in misery for all others, such a head already existed. The man named Gendrik Jagoda received an idea that would turn the lives of many into pure hell. By this point, the collectivization was causing major hunger all over the place, and people were dropping like flies. Jagoda's job was to oversee all the riots caused by collectivization, with the task of carrying out all the Stalin's decrees, but without many people starving to death. So you can see the sheer cruelty in this position. Take away everything from people, but still somehow keep them alive, literally walking dead, so you can squeeze them even more. The Soviet Union was planning to establish farms to work on, and at the same time those who disagreed had to be punished. So Jagoda came up with a solution to combine these two things. Relocate 2 million people to Siberia, give them tools and force them to create self-sustaining farms. And from that moment on, the nightmare began. Due to certain norms that had to be filled, Jagoda and his thugs even arrested people who didn't fit the profile, and hundreds of thousands of people across the country simply disappeared without any explanation to their families. By this point, the search for them was pretty much an hopeless task, and Jagoda knew that, while at the same time he was boarding all the people on trains. Where did the trains go, you may ask? Well, let's just say the rails weren't pointed to a nice place. The destination was ice-cold Siberia, and with conditions so bad, dozens of people died on the way. And as bad as this may sound, those who did can be considered lucky. Now, you might conclude that the endeavor of this magnitude had to be well planned and executed, but that was simply not the case. It was fast, but in that process, the actual logistics were a disaster. The small city of Tomsk was supposed to host all the arriving people, but the problem was the city was too small and the number of people was unfortunately very high. By May 93, there were almost 90,000 prisoners in Tomsk, but there was still no solution. So the authorities decided that someone else had to deal with the problem. They boarded the first 5,000 prisoners along with 50 guards on wooden barges and escorted them across the Ob River to an island near Nazino village. Since Nazino is some 800 kilometers away, the journey to the place was certainly not pleasant, and with only 200 grams of bread per day, no surprise, by the time they reached the final destination, 27 people had died. However, those who had not stepped into their nightmare. The island had traces of swamp, barely 3 kilometers long and some 600 meters wide, and was completely deserted. The only visitors to this place were the locals from time to time, who used to gather wood, otherwise it looked like a ghost town. The trees that were there were supposed to be used for cutting and making huts, but all was basically useless, because the prisoners didn't receive any kind of tools to actually build some shelters, so they were immediately exposed to bad weather and extreme cold temperatures. The next morning, another 295 people died as a result of these factors, and from that moment on, a brutal survival began. Given that a large proportion of the prisoners sent to the island consisted of ordinary people who had been forcibly brought in and had no knowledge of how to survive or cultivate the land, a major problem soon arose. 200 grams of bread they had while traveling in barges now became even smaller. The guards didn't give them bread anymore, but only a small portion of the flour, and forced them to make their own bread. Many, in addition to the already desperate state, either ate it raw or mixed it with dirty river water, which led to the outbreak of dysentery. If this was not cruel enough, things soon got much worse. 4 days after the barges arrived on the island, the prisoners experienced new degrees of suffering. Ice rain killed people every night, while those who managed to start a fire due to the cold lay too close to them and eventually burned. Also, due to the lack of resources and food, the daily fighting and killing became a regular thing. The guards agreed to give them new portions, but according to different rules. Instead of giving portions individually, all survivors had to organize into groups of 150 people, and each of these groups had to have a representative who would then share equal shares among the other members. Now, since this whole group consisted of all kinds of people like murderers and psychopaths, they presented themselves as leaders at the same time, and the guards accepted this choice without hesitation and divided certain portions. So, because of the new rules, starvation has started for everyone except a handful of people. The logical question in a situation like this would be, why people just didn't try to escape from the island? In essence, they were, but the water was so cold that a heart failure and drowning would follow. Or, if they somehow managed to swim to the other side, they would be shot by the guards. Those who somehow survived all this would be hunted like animals for sport. Almost 10 days later, a new group of more than 1,000 people arrived, and things got even more miserable. Soon, the separation began. The stronger ones were divided into clans and terrorized those weaker than themselves, and killing for food became a daily thing, but it was still not enough. While June was slowly on the horizon, those who did survive had to do the only things that were left. With so many bodies laying around, they simply went to eat them. However, that was only the beginning. Soon, this progressed to killing people who were too weak to defend and cook their meat. Later, one of the interrogated prisoners was asked about this topic, and his answer was, "It was very simple. We made chopsticks from wooden twigs, cut corpses, and baked pieces of meat over a fire. I chose those who were not dead, but were not quite alive either. It was clear that they would die in 2 or 3 days, so it was easier for them this way. Now, quickly and without suffering." In the ocean of horrors that took place on the island, there is a report of a girl named Kostya who slept with a guard for food. People grabbed her, tied her to a pole, and then cut off almost all the parts they could use. You know, the things were so bad when even a monster like Stalin decided it was time to cut the experiment. About a month after arriving, Tomsk authorities dismantled the camp. The prisoners were evacuated to other farms, the guards returned to the city, and the island was abandoned. In a period of 1 month, a total of almost 7,000 inhabitants lived on the island. Less than 2,200 survived. All the remaining settlers went missing, were killed by weather or by other people. And only the locals were more or less familiar with the horrors that took place.